My name is Sarah Mitchell. I have 61 years old and I'm from Provo, Utah. For more than 30 years, I was part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I lived to serve, to obey, to believe that God's truth lay within. I was that woman everyone saw as an example of faith, purity, and devotion. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered. A secret so deep, so hidden, that it changed everything I believed about faith, obedience, and salvation. Today, I decided to speak out, not out of revenge, but because silence also became a sin. I need to tell what I saw and what I experienced. Comment your city and country so I know how far my voice is reaching. Leave your like and subscribe if you believe that faith must go hand in hand with truth. I still remember the day I first walked into a church hall. It was a sunny Sunday, the kind of morning when everything seems purer, calmer, as if heaven itself were smiling. I was young, full of dreams, and with a heart hungry for purpose. When those missionaries knocked on my door, speaking with such conviction about a restored gospel, something inside me was ignited. I wanted to believe. I needed to believe that there was a place where God still spoke, where the truth had not been corrupted. The Mormon Church offered me exactly that, absolute certainty in a world full of doubt. I remember the first time I opened the Book of Mormon, the words seemed to shine before my eyes. I cried without understanding why, feeling an emotion that completely overwhelmed me. When I was baptized, I felt as if a new life had begun. People around me hugged me, called me sister, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged to something bigger than myself. From that day on, every minute of my time revolved around faith. I attended every meeting, helped with women's classes, sang in the choirs, and organized missionary dinners. The community was united, like a spiritual family, sustained by the same ideal. I felt part of something great, a spiritual family united by faith. This was my truth, and for many years, I lived joyfully within it. The mission I received years later was the pinnacle of my devotion. I was sent to another state, and I'm proud to say I preached the word with love and sincerity. I knocked on hundreds of doors, spoke about the plan of salvation, about Joseph Smith, about the promise that one day we would be together in eternity. I believed every word that came out of my mouth, sometimes even more than I believed in myself, because faith, at that time, was my breath. There was something so beautiful about that beginning. The way everyone called each other brothers and sisters, the way we shared meals and testimonies, the way we believed the world could be saved if everyone knew the true gospel. It was pure, almost childlike innocence. I looked at the leaders with awe. When the prophet spoke in general conference, I felt as if God himself were whispering. No doubt dared enter my mind. Everything made sense. Everything seemed perfect. The church also taught me values. I deeply respected discipline, charity, work, family. I was married in the temple, following every rule, every commandment. I wore modest clothing, observed Sunday, paid my tithing, and prayed daily. I wanted to be worthy. I wanted God to look at me and say, "This is my faithful daughter." When someone asked me about my faith, I spoke with a sparkle in my eyes, as if I had found heaven itself. But behind this light was something I couldn't see, or perhaps I didn't want to see. Obedience, which I called virtue, was beginning to turn into dependence. I didn't realize it, but with each decision I stopped making for myself, a little piece of my freedom was lost. I thought happiness was serving without question, that sacrifice was the ultimate proof of love for God, and little by little, I began to conform to what was expected of me, until I no longer recognized my own voice. I remember one time, during a conference when the stake leader said something I've never forgotten: "Obedience is the first principle of heaven." At that moment, everyone nodded, and so did I. But today, when I think about that phrase, it sounds different, because what I understood as divine obedience may have been the beginning of human control. In the early years, there was no room for doubt. When I saw someone questioning, I thought, "This brother is weak in faith." When someone left the church, I believed they had been deceived by Satan. I truly did, and perhaps that's why I surrendered so much, closed my eyes to everything around me, because, deep down, the fear of losing faith was greater than the desire to see the truth. My mother used to say I was born with a sensitive heart. She saw in me a sincere faith, and called me a gentle spirit. I think that's what made me believe so strongly. I didn't see the church as just a religion. It was my home, my security, the foundation of everything. I had friends there, a life built there, and a deep sense of purpose. But the years passed, and something began to change. Small cracks began to appear in the walls of my perfect world. A harsh comment from a leader here, a judgment disguised as advice there. Small things, but they left a strange feeling in my chest. I ignored them, like someone sweeping dust under the rug. Maybe this is just a test, I told myself. God is testing me. But little by little, the cracks grew. The people who once embraced me with love began to act distant. Promises of comfort became demands for perfection. And the faith that once freed me began to imprison me. Yet, I continued to believe. I continued to defend, preach, obey. Because that was what I knew how to do, believe. What I didn't know was that, behind that appearance of harmony, there were secrets kept under lock and key. Secrets that would one day pierce my life like a wound impossible to ignore. And when that happened, all the light I thought I'd found turned to shadow. But back then I didn't know it yet. I was still the woman who smiled in ward photos, who spoke sweetly in sisters' meetings, who believed in the power of fasting and the priesthood. I was still the woman who prayed on her knees, giving thanks for having found the right path. I still believed that faith could heal everything, and perhaps that's why the fall was so painful. Because the higher you climb in faith, the deeper the abyss when the truth finally comes out. In the early years, I immersed myself completely in church service. I woke before dawn to prepare for meetings, organized events for the young women, helped with children's classes, visited sick members, and spent hours in the chapel cleaning pews and windows, as if every simple gesture were a direct offering to God. The leaders said that working in the kingdom was the greatest privilege anyone could have. I believed it with all my soul. Every task felt sacred, every obligation a divine calling. I remember my first missionary baptism. I cried with emotion as I watched that person enter the waters and begin a new spiritual life. At that moment, I felt that all the effort, all the exhaustion, was worth it. I saw myself as a small piece in God's grand plan. It didn't matter if no one thanked me, or if the work was invisible. The reward, they said, would come in the Lord's due time. And I repeated this phrase every night before bed, like someone holding on to a promise they don't yet understand, but choose to trust. As the years passed, my dedication grew. If someone was needed to direct a choir, I was there. If someone was needed to teach the children, I volunteered. If a leader needed help preparing for priesthood meetings, I showed up even without being asked. I worked on fundraisers, cooked for events, organized bazaars, and followed up with new converts. Sometimes I would go weeks without a single free day, but deep inside there was a quiet satisfaction. I felt that the more I did, the closer I would be to heaven. At the conferences, I felt a sincere pride. The prophet's words echoed throughout the hall, and I wrote down every sentence, as if they were direct instructions from God Himself. When He said, "Follow the leaders, they will never lead you astray," my heart filled with confidence. I didn't question, I simply obeyed. I didn't follow men, I thought I followed the voice of God. This conviction gave me an artificial but powerful peace. I felt protected, guided, chosen. When doubt crept in, I called it temptation. When something didn't make sense, I thought, the problem is with me, not them. This is how obedience became a form of armor, one that kept me from thinking but made me feel safe. The weeks were all the same: Mondays of planning, Wednesdays of rehearsals, Fridays of visitation, Sundays of worship and testimony. There was no time for rest, no space for reflection. The pace was what kept the mind busy. The enemy works in idleness, they said, so I kept my body tired so my soul wouldn't have time to question. During the monthly fasts, I struggled not to give in to hunger. They said sacrifice purified the heart, and I wanted to be worthy. When someone broke their fast early, I felt sad, asked if that small failure were a betrayal of faith. There was an invisible hierarchy, and we all wanted to be at the top, even if no one would admit it. The appearance of spirituality became a kind of silent competition. Whoever prayed more, fasted more, served more, was seen as closer to the Lord. My life became a religious script: wake up, pray, serve, repeat. Everything revolved around the church. Friends, leisure, family, everything came later. Others called me an exemplary woman, a modern-day saint. Some joked, I smiled, but deep inside, I began to feel a strange emptiness. The more I served, the less I felt God's presence. A sister in my ward once asked me if I had ever felt the Holy Ghost really speak. I remained silent. I had never heard a voice, never seen visions, never felt the warmth everyone described in their testimonies. There was only weariness I called faith. Still, I pressed on. I believed obedience was the way, even when it didn't make sense. God's ways are not our ways, I repeated to myself whenever I saw something strange. When a leader spoke harshly, I told him he was inspired to correct. When a teaching hurt me, I thought it was God molding me. Didn't realize that faith, when blind, ceases to be faith and becomes submission. One episode stuck in my memory. During a conference, one of the local 70 spoke about not murmuring against the leaders. He said that Satan had begun his rebellion precisely by questioning divine authority. The words fell on me like stones. To question is to rebel. I wrote it down and kept it in my heart. That day, I made a silent promise never to doubt. It was the most sincere and most dangerous vow I have ever made. From then on, I began to see leaders almost as sacred figures. When the bishop entered a room, I lowered my gaze in respect. When a missionary spoke, I listened as if he were an angel. When the prophet appeared on TV, I knelt, even alone, at home. Obedience shaped me, calmed me, but it also began to erase me. I used to think the purpose of faith was to eliminate doubt. Today, I realize its real purpose is to transform it into wisdom. But back then, doubt was a sin and thinking was dangerous. So I stopped thinking, and that's exactly why it took me so long to see. I lived like this for decades, surrendering my soul to a system I believed to be sacred. Every tear shed in prayer, every hour lost in rehearsals, every Sunday without rest, it all seemed part of God's plan. I didn't follow men. I believed I followed God's voice. But one day, the voice I'd heard so often began to sound different. And that's when I realized, maybe I'd never been God's voice. Maybe I was just the echo of the voices of those I'd learned to obey without thinking. In the early years, I believed the church was a perfect reflection of heaven. There was order to everything, the leaders seemed wise, the meetings were organized, and the words from the pulpit seemed to come directly from God. But gradually, small cracks began to appear, subtle, almost imperceptible, like cracks in a stained glass window that only reveal themselves when sunlight hits them from a different angle. The first sign came from something banal. A sister in the ward, a simple, widowed woman, struggling financially, asked the bishop for help buying medicine. He said the church could only help through personal effort and suggested she sell some belongings. The following Sunday, however, the same leadership approved donations to more influential families, with well-known surnames and prestigious positions. No one questioned it. When I mentioned this to another sister, she replied, "It is not our place to judge the decisions of the priesthood." That day, something in me fell silent. I began to observe more closely. There was subtle favoritism, privileges disguised as blessings. Children of leaders were given positions in the most sought-after missions, while humble young men were sent to distant and difficult places. The women closest to the bishopric were always praised and invited to committees, while others, more reserved, were barely noticed. Council meetings seemed more political than spiritual ones. During a women's leadership meeting, the stake president's wife said, "We need to remember that appearance also reflects our spiritual worth." I looked down at my simple dress and felt a tightness in my chest. Gradually, I realized that the church that claimed to value the heart was silently judging by appearances. Contradictions began to mount. They preached humility, but exalted status. They spoke of charity, but kept their distance from those most in need. They said everyone was equal before God, but it was clear that some were more inspired than others. And whenever anyone questioned something, the answer was the same: pray more. The blind trust I had in leaders began to turn into discomfort. I remembered phrases spoken from pulpits: "Leaders are called by divine revelation," and wondered, if that's so, why do they err so much? Why does the Holy Spirit seem absent when it comes to justice? I tried to silence these questions, but they returned, ever more insistent. One night, after a meeting, I overheard two brothers talking in the parking lot. They spoke in low tones, thinking no one was listening. One of them said, "The decision has already been made. The bishop wants to keep it confidential until the next conference." The other's voice replied, "But what if the members find out?" And then the first concluded, "They won't find out. Only those who need to know will know." That echoed in my head. Only those who need to know. It was strange to hear that in a place that preached transparency and truth, there were also the whispers, the exchanged glances, the conversations that stopped when someone approached. Little by little, I realized there was an invisible layer within the church, a closed circle where decisions were made hidden from the eyes of the faithful. They called them sensitive matters. I called them secrets. Once, a young missionary was hastily transferred. They said he had committed a moral error, but no one explained what it was. Years later, I learned he had reported something about a local leader. The case was hushed up, and the young man disappeared from conversations. When I asked why, the bishop responded with a cold smile, "Don't worry, sister, the Lord takes care of his own." And then I understood there were things that shouldn't be asked. My husband, who also served in the church, began to notice my discomfort. "You're allowing the enemy to sow doubt," he would say. "Don't trust your thoughts, trust the hierarchy." And I tried, I swear I did. But little by little, the meetings that once filled me with light began to oppress me. I would sit in the pews and, instead of feeling peace, I felt the weight of something I couldn't name. One Sunday, during a testimony from one of the leaders, he said, "If a prophet says right is wrong and wrong is right, trust him because God will guide him." People around me wept, raised their hands, murmured amens. I just stood there. What if the prophet is wrong? I thought. What if God is silent? This question stayed with me until the end of the day, and in that moment, I realized something inside me had changed forever. The small inconsistencies became a labyrinth. There were instructions that contradicted each other. Leaders who preached one thing and did another. Some spoke of chastity but were seen in suspicious places. Others preached humility but showed off luxurious homes and new cars, bought with tithe money. Blessings come to the faithful, they said. But faith always seemed to favor the same people. I began to avoid looking too much, asking too much, thinking too much. The church had taught me that questioning was a lack of faith, and I was afraid of losing my salvation. Yet something inside me whispered that something was wrong. It was as if the light that had once guided me had begun to flicker. The spirit I felt began to feel more like fear than faith. Fear of making mistakes, fear of displeasing, fear of doubt. It was a fear disguised as reverence, a silence disguised as obedience. I continued to smile in the hallways, participate in classes, sing in the choirs, but inside, something was breaking a little more with each passing day. Until one day, during a collective prayer, I felt an emptiness so profound it almost brought me to tears. There was no spirit anymore, only the sound of voices repeating words that seemed memorized. It was then that I realized, maybe I wasn't losing my faith. Maybe I was, for the first time, beginning to find it outside the shadows they called light. It all began unexpectedly, as it often does when the truth reveals itself. I was helping organize old ward documents, membership records, meeting minutes, baptism reports. It was a simple job, but it required attention. The bishop had asked me to keep everything in order and destroy old papers that were no longer needed. It was a common task. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Until, amidst the yellowed folders, I found something that shouldn't have been there. It was a manila envelope, undated and unmarked, marked only with the words, "Confidential leadership only." Inside were handwritten letters from church members. The first few seemed like simple requests for spiritual guidance, confessions of faith, repentance, requests for blessings. But as I read, the tone of the letters changed. Some spoke of fear, others of silence. One read, "I went to the stake president's house for counseling, and he asked me to keep it a secret." I stopped reading for a moment, my heart racing. I continued, and the next words chilled my blood. It was a woman's account, written in shaky handwriting, of having been abused by a church leader during a supposed worthiness interview. She said she tried to speak to the bishop but was told not to tarnish the name of the priesthood. Another letter, written by a man, spoke of the misappropriation of tithing funds for personal leadership purposes. They all ended with the same sentence, "I trust the Lord will bring justice." My hands trembled. With each page I read, my faith wavered further. These people had sought help and were silenced. I knew I shouldn't be reading, but I couldn't stop. It was as if God was forcing me to see what so many pretended not to. The next day, I took the envelope to the bishop. He turned pale, took a deep breath, and asked me to leave it with him. I asked if anything would be done. He simply replied, "There are things that belong to the Lord's domain, not ours." And then, looking me straight in the eye. He added, "It would be better if you forgot what you saw." I left that room with a sinking feeling in my stomach. During the Sunday service, I looked up at the pulpit and saw that same bishop preaching about repentance and moral purity. He spoke about how sin begins in the mind and ends in the destruction of the soul. People wept and nodded in agreement. And I, sitting there in the pew, could only think, the destruction has already begun, but it comes from silence. In the following weeks, the atmosphere changed. Some leaders began treating me coldly. They called me in for private conversations, where they told me I seemed troubled and that the enemy could use even the faithful to sow discord. It was an attempt at intimidation disguised as spiritual care. When I mentioned that some of the letters seemed serious, one of the counselors responded with icy calm. "The church is perfect, but people are not. Don't mix the two." But I could no longer separate. What I had seen was not an isolated human error. It was a system of silence. Victims asked for help, and the responses came in the form of veiled threats or scriptural quotations used as walls. I discovered an internal protocol for dealing with sensitive issues where reports went directly to higher authorities, who, in turn, filed them away to protect the name of the church. It was around this time that I heard about a brother who had been excommunicated for apostasy. He had publicly questioned the conduct of a local leader, and a few days later, his name was stricken from the records. The official justification: sowing discord among the saints. I discreetly sought him out, and he told me his story. With tears in his eyes, he said, "They took my name, but not my love for God, but their God is not mine." It was like hearing an echo of what I already felt. I realized that the faith I had served for so many years had become a power structure, one where loyalty trumped truth, and the higher one rose in the hierarchy. The further away from Christ they seemed to become. One night, I couldn't sleep. I went to the empty temple, sat on the steps, and cried. I looked up at the imposing, illuminated building, and for the first time, it seemed cold and distant. That place, which had once represented heaven, now reminded me of a fortress built to hide secrets. The light at the top, which I had previously seen as a symbol of divine presence, now seemed only a beacon trying to obscure the darkness within. That night, I spoke to God, not the God of leaders, nor the God of recited scriptures, but the God who dwells in the sincere silence of the soul. I asked why he had allowed this. The answer came not in words, but in a strange sense of clarity. Perhaps he had never asked me to trust in men. The following days were filled with confusion and fear. I began to notice suspicious looks and whispered comments. One brother told me that my spirituality was weakening. Another sister suggested I request an interview with the bishop to restore my testimony. It was as if the simple act of knowing too much were a sin. And then one of the women mentioned in the letters disappeared from the meetings. I asked about her, and was told she had stepped away for personal reasons. Days later, I received an anonymous message. "Thank you for trying to find out, but they will never let this come to light." I cried again, not from anger, but from helplessness. That day I realized that the truth they hide is darker than any sin they condemn. They speak of repentance, but admit no guilt. They speak of purity, but cover up impurity. They speak of light, but live in the shadows. God does not dwell where lies are sanctified. And it was in that moment that I understood that my faith hadn't died. It just didn't fit there anymore. Because where the truth is silenced, the spirit has already departed, and all that remains is an empty institution, sustained by fear and obedience. That manila envelope, hastily tucked away in a locked drawer, contained more than papers. It contained the beginning of my awakening, and ever since, I've understood that the greatest heresy isn't doubting the church, it's remaining silent when your conscience cries out that God is absent. For weeks, the weight of what I knew began to crush me inside. I would wake in the middle of the night with my heart racing, as if someone were watching me. Even in the dark, the silence that had once felt like peace now had a different sound, that of suffocating guilt. I knew too much, and within the church, knowing too much was dangerous. I tried to continue attending meetings, as if nothing had happened. I sang along to the hymns, smiled in class, and responded amen to the prayers, but it all sounded false, distant, mechanical. Every time the bishop took the pulpit, I felt a knot in my stomach. He spoke of repentance, purity, and righteousness, and all I could remember were the hidden letters, the handwritten tears of people who were never heard. One Sunday during Sunday school, one of the leaders said, God reveals his mysteries only to the worthy. Those who murmur lose the Spirit. Those words fell upon me like a sentence. I no longer felt the Spirit. And for the first time, I was afraid they were right, afraid that questioning would mean turning away from God. Over the next few weeks, the invitations for private conversations began. First, a counselor called me in to check in on me spiritually. He sat across from me, smiled, and asked if I still felt a testimony of the church. When I hesitated, he leaned over and said, "Sister, the adversary works through doubt. Sometimes silence is the purest proof of faith." I left that room confused and ashamed. Was I the one in the wrong? Then the bishop arrived. He was more direct. He said that my comments were worrying some brothers and that it would be best to avoid certain sensitive topics. I hadn't spoken to anyone other than my family, which meant they were watching me. He concluded by saying, "If the Lord has shown you something, it's because he trusts you to keep it in your heart until the right time." But that right time never came. There was only a time of fear. The fear of being called an apostate, the fear of losing friends, the fear of tarnishing my family's name. Within the church, the worst thing someone could be was a rebellious spirit, and all I wanted was to remain seen as faithful, so I kept quiet. Silence became routine. I no longer spoke about what I saw, not even to myself. It was easier to repeat cliches, "The Lord knows what he's doing. Everything happens for a purpose," than to face the abyss of truth. But inside me, something was sickening. I prayed and felt empty. I fasted and felt weak. And when I knelt, what had once been faith now felt like fear disguised as devotion. The silence felt like a prayer, but it was a prison. At home, my husband noticed my change. He asked what was wrong, and I replied that I was just tired. He, faithful as ever, said it was just a spiritual phase, that I should seek the bishop for a blessing. I obeyed, still believing it could cure me. On the day of the blessing, the bishop placed his hands on my head and began to pray. His voice was firm, solemn, but the words pierced me like blades. He said, "Lord, strengthen this servant so she will not listen to the voices of confusion." It was as if he were asking God to silence me even further. I left worse off than when I arrived. The nights grew long. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. I relived every word, every look, every time I felt the Spirit being traded for convenience. I began to experience anxiety attacks, chest pains, palpitations. At the doctor's, they said it was stress. I knew it was something else, my body screaming what my soul could no longer bear. I began avoiding the temple. I told myself I was out of time, but the truth was, I couldn't stand that white silence anymore, the walls that seemed to echo prayers no one could hear. Everything there reminded me that I was trapped not by bars, but by doctrines. And the worst part was that the prison was gilded. Everyone was smiling. Everyone seemed happy. It was impossible to convince anyone that there was darkness behind that light. One night, I received a call from a sister I barely knew. Her voice was shaking. She said she'd also seen strange things and that they wanted to transfer her to another ward. She asked me not to say anything. For God's sake. When I hung up, I realized I wasn't the only one carrying a burden that couldn't be told. The following Sunday, the stake president preached on the blessings of obedience. He said that questioning leadership was like questioning God himself. The people applauded. I just looked around and felt dizzy. Don't they see? I thought. Don't they see this faith being used as a chain? But no one seemed to notice. The days became heavy. I felt like a stranger among the brothers I once called my spiritual family. My body began to react. Insomnia, nausea, unexplained fevers. With each meeting, I felt weaker, more distant, more empty. My soul seemed to wither, like a flower forgotten in the shade. I tried asking for spiritual help, but the answers were always the same. Pray more, fast more, trust more. None of them really listened to what I was saying. They wanted to fix me, not understand me. One day, while cleaning the chapel kitchen after an event, I overheard one of the leaders commenting to another, "She's very sensitive. We need to watch her before she backslides." They didn't know I was nearby. Those words hurt me more than any open insult. They didn't want to heal, they wanted to control. I tried to convince myself that silence was the right choice, that God would reward me for my obedience. But deep down, I knew I was slowly dying. Because truth, when stifled, doesn't die, it rots inside us. I began writing in secret. Small rants in a notebook hidden in the closet. There, I said everything I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about fear, about faith fading, about the feeling of being alone even when surrounded by people. Writing became my silent confession, the only place where I could still breathe. One day I wrote a sentence that I never forgot. Silence may seem like faith, but sometimes it is just cowardice with a pretty name. At that moment, I understood what was truly sickening me. It wasn't sin, it wasn't doubt, it wasn't isolation, it was silence. The same silence I was taught to call obedience, the same silence the church called faith. And that's when I realized the prison had no locks, but it had fear. And as long as the fear was greater than the truth, I would remain there kneeling, praying to a God who didn't want my obedience, wanted my voice. The crisis came silently, like a tide that advances, without warning. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, that everything would be resolved with more fasting, more prayer, more effort. But what was growing inside me wasn't a lack of faith, it was the awareness that something was deeply wrong. I still bent my knees every night, but what had once been light became a distant echo. I began to pray, and the sky seemed silent. The words spilled from my mouth, but they didn't seem to go anywhere. Before, I'd felt the Spirit enveloping me like a gentle warmth. Now, there was only a cold, heavy emptiness. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. Sometimes I prayed and cried at the same time, begging God to speak to me, to show me if I was wrong. But the answer was silence. A silence so deep it ached in my bones. Days became long. I went to church out of obligation, but I felt like an imposter. People still greeted me with smiles and rehearsed phrases. "How's your faith, sister?" And I responded with the same lie, strong as ever. But inside, I felt shattered. The scriptures no longer comforted me. The hymns no longer touched me. Even the collective prayers seemed cold, mechanical, and repetitive, as if everyone were reciting something they no longer truly believed. I began avoiding meetings. I said I was sick, tired, busy. The truth was, I couldn't stand listening to leaders talk about obedience while ignoring the suffering they helped create. Every word from the pulpit was a cruel reminder that the faith I knew had been transformed into a tool of control. The faith I was taught has turned into a shadow. The nights were worse. Sleep became my enemy. I lay down, my heart racing, reliving everything I'd seen, everything I'd kept silent. The faces of those people in the letters I'd found haunted me. It was as if I'd betrayed them by remaining silent. I heard their imaginary voices whispering between the pages. "Why didn't you speak?" I began to have nightmares. I dreamed of the temple empty, of voices praying in a language I didn't understand. I saw faceless leaders, surrounded by white lights that looked like blades. I woke up sweating, my heart racing, and knelt to pray, but again, nothing. Just the echo of my own voice. Loneliness grew like an invisible wall between me and the rest of the world. Friends who once called me disappeared. Some sisters began avoiding contact. Others looked at me with pity, as if I were spiritually sick. One of them even said to me, in a tone both sweet and cruel at the same time, "Sometimes the Lord withdraws the Spirit to teach us humility." I smiled and agreed, but inside I screamed, "It's not humility, it's despair." At home, the atmosphere had also changed. My husband, still faithful to the church, didn't understand what I was feeling. He said I was letting the enemy in. Sometimes he looked at me with sadness, other times with suppressed anger. He still believed, and I didn't want to destroy his faith, but I couldn't keep pretending either. We began to live side by side, like two strangers who shared the same pain but couldn't talk about it. Isolation consumed me. I stopped singing, stopped laughing. I spent hours staring out the window, trying to remember the exact moment my faith began to die. But the more I tried to find someone to blame, the more I realized it hadn't died, it had been suffocated. And the culprit wasn't God. It was the sanctified lies, the hidden secrets, the fear disguised as obedience. I began to doubt everything, the promises, the prophets, the revelations. Every utterance sounded like a calculated repetition. And the more I listened, the more I realized the truth was missing. One Sunday, the stake president said from the pulpit, "Even when we don't understand, we must follow the prophet. That's what faith means." I looked around and saw everyone nodding, as if they had given up thinking. It was at that moment that I realized I no longer belonged there. But leaving wasn't easy. The church doesn't bind you with chains, it binds you with fear. the fear of losing family, friends, salvation, the fear of being labeled an apostate, and this fear accompanied me every step of the way. I tried to convince myself it was safer to stay, but something inside me knew that remaining there was a slow death. I began writing more and more in my hidden notebook. It was the only way to hear myself, to keep from going mad. I wrote short sentences, almost like prayers. God, where are you? I just want to understand. Why is the Lord silent when the righteous suffer? Sometimes I cried so hard, the words blurred onto the paper. Other times, I just stared at the blank page, waiting for some answer to come down from heaven. Little by little, I realized my physical health was beginning to fail. My body reflected what my soul carried. I lost weight, my appetite disappeared, and exhaustion became part of my routine. I went to the doctor and heard the diagnosis: anxiety disorder with depressive symptoms. I smiled, unsure whether to laugh or cry. How could I explain that what was making me sick wasn't the world, it was the church? The temple, once a symbol of light, now seemed to me a labyrinth of marble and silence. I avoided it, but sometimes I drove past it, and just seeing its towers was enough to make my chest tighten. That building no longer represented heaven, it was a reminder of the faith I had lost. I began walking the streets alone, trying to talk to God outside the church walls. I looked up to the sky and asked, "Do you still hear me?" And though there was no voice, I began to feel something different. It wasn't the Spirit, as I'd been taught, but a gentle, free, unafraid presence. It was as if God were saying, "I was never trapped in there. You were the one who stayed." But the return to faith didn't happen immediately. It was a slow, painful process, made up of falls and rebuildings. For months, I lived in limbo, without church, without community, without answers. It was a spiritual desert, and each day without prayer was an open wound. Still, something inside me knew that the path to truth didn't lie through blind obedience. Today I understand that what I experienced was the morning of a faith that was never minute, was imposed, molded, conditioned. True faith needs neither walls nor leaders to exist. It is born in the honest encounter between human beings and God. And in that phase, amidst the solitude and silence, I realized something essential. I hadn't lost God, I was just finding Him outside the shadow they called light. The awakening didn't happen overnight, but in small bursts that opened cracks in the darkness. After months of silence and confusion, something inside me began to shift. I could no longer continue living divided between fear and awareness. It was like standing before a locked door, and even without the key, my soul was already pushing hard to get out. I needed to understand. I needed to know if what I was experiencing was an isolated incident or part of something much larger. I began in secret, during sleepless nights. At first, I opened forums and blogs of former members, the ones the church always told me to avoid. "These sites are tools of the enemy," the bishop said. But what I found there wasn't rebellion, it was truth. Stories of ordinary people, faithful, devout, who had experienced the same doubts, the same spiritual abuse, the same guilt. I read testimonies of women who suffered humiliation in so-called worthiness interviews, of men who were expelled for questioning local leaders, of families destroyed by internal secrets. Every word was a mirror. At first, I cried. It was painful to realize that my pain wasn't unique, but soon the crying turned to relief. I wasn't crazy, nor lost. I was waking up. Those voices, previously silenced, showed me that I wasn't the first to see what was wrong. And for the first time, I realized that questioning wasn't a sin. It was an act of courage. It wasn't apostasy. It was lucidity. I went further. I began searching for documents, old archives, historical accounts. I discovered that the church kept information rarely discussed in meetings, records of leaders removed for misconduct, hush-hush agreements to hush up scandals, letters sent by victims who never received a response. I read about changes in doctrine, suppressed texts, oaths few knew existed. And the more I read, the more my old faith crumbled, but, paradoxically, something purer was born in its place. I remember the day I came across a testimony from a former bishop who said, "Within the church, obedience is more important than conscience. But outside of it, I learned that God doesn't need intermediaries." That phrase stuck with me. I had always believed that my salvation depended on leaders, rules, and rituals, but in that moment, I realized that my soul would only be saved when I returned to my own. I decided to talk to old friends who had left the Church, it was a difficult step. Fear still followed me, like a faithful shadow. I called a woman named Sarah, whose name I found on a forum. She answered calmly and said, "I thought you would never call." I was afraid to, but the peace that comes after the truth is something the church can never offer. We talked for hours. She told me how she lost everything, friends, family, reputation, but gained something greater, freedom. And at the end of the call, she said something I've never forgotten. God never asked you to be silent. That was a human invention. It was the first night in a long time that I could sleep peacefully, not because all the answers had come, but because I had finally stopped lying to myself. In the following days, I began to write down everything I discovered. I kept a detailed journal, not out of revenge, but out of a need to understand. With each new piece of information, the curtain fell further. I discovered how the church's finances were tightly controlled, but without transparency, how certain families of leaders perpetuated their power, how guilt was used as a tool of discipline. Everything there was a mechanism on faith, the fuel. But what struck me most was realizing how so many people had been hurt and remained afraid to speak out. I found support groups formed by ex-Mormons, where tears and laughter mingled. They were simple people. Some still believed in God, others not, but they all had one thing in common. They were relearning how to breathe. I attended one of these online meetings, and I remember a man who said, "The worst prison is the one you believe is heaven." That hit me hard. It was then that I realized that true awakening is not when you reject faith, it's when you begin to understand that faith can exist outside the walls that have imprisoned it. I started praying again, but in a different way, without rituals, without formulas, without fear. I spoke to God like one would speak to a friend, without promises, without masks. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something real. It wasn't the typical heat of meetings, nor the emotional thrill of choir songs. It was something simple, peace, a gentle, almost silent peace that demanded nothing in return. I began walking alone on Sundays, while the others went to chapel. I observed the sky, the wind, the sound of the birds, and there, amidst nature, I felt a more divine presence than I had ever felt inside a church. I realized that God was not lost. It was just that I had been taught to look for him in the wrong place. One afternoon, I sat in the park with my journal in hand and reread everything I had written. From my first doubts to that moment of clarity, I cried, but not from sadness. I cried because I realized how much I had betrayed myself in the name of a faith that had never belonged to me. But along with the tears came lightness. It was as if something inside me had finally broken and, at the same time, silently rebuilt itself. Liberation came, not with anger, but with understanding. I didn't have to destroy anything to be free. It was enough to stop supporting what was a lie. Some called me an apostate, others said I had fallen from the Spirit. I smile when I hear that. If they knew that it was outside the walls that I found what I was truly looking for, that it was in doubt that I discovered the truth, perhaps they would want to fall too. Today I understand that what I experienced wasn't a loss of faith, it was a spiritual awakening, because only those who dare to open their eyes awaken, even when everyone around them prefers to remain asleep. It wasn't apostasy, it was lucidity. And this lucidity, which at first frightened me, became my healing. Pain became learning. Fear became discernment. Faith, once blind, is now conscious. And God finally stopped being a distant voice and became the silence that dwells within me, that silence that doesn't oppress, but embraces. That's how what once began with guilt ended in freedom, and for the first time in my life, I understood the true meaning of the word testimony. It's not repeating what you're told, it's having the courage to say what you've discovered yourself. I began to realize that the loneliness of my journey wasn't really loneliness. There was an invisible thread connecting me to others who, like me, had awakened. Little by little, I found these voices in online groups, in discreet conversations, in late-night messages exchanged with people I'd never met but who seemed to know me deeply. It was as if each of us carried a part of the same secret, and when we spoke, our wounds began to resonate. At first, I was afraid to participate. The words "former members" still sounded like condemnation. I remembered the leader's warnings: "He who abandons the flock is devoured by the enemy." But when I heard the first reports, I understood that these weren't wolves, they were survivors. Each story ripped away a piece of the guilt I still carried. They were fathers, mothers, young people, old people, all united by the pain of having believed too much and been betrayed by their own faith. A woman named Rebecca shared that she had been expelled from a church calling after reporting the indecent behavior of a local leader. She wept as she said her husband left her for shaming the priesthood. Another man, named David, shared that he saw his own family turn their backs when he decided to speak out about financial manipulation. And amidst those tears and memories, something unexpected happened. There was light, because even with so much pain, none of them had given up on God. They had simply given up calling God that which denied them love. In one of the virtual meetings, someone said a phrase that deeply resonated with me. What the church calls rebellion is often the beginning of healing. I was silent for a few seconds, and I realized that this was exactly it. The moment I stopped blindly obeying was the moment I began to heal. It was there, amidst wounded voices, that I found the true meaning of faith. Not the faith that demands submission, but the faith that teaches us to rise up. I began attending these meetings frequently. Each meeting was a rebirth. We discussed topics that were previously off-limit: psychological pressure, guilt, abuse, manipulation. But, most importantly, we talked about starting over. And the most beautiful thing was seeing how everyone, even though marked by different histories, shared a common desire to transform suffering into something that could help others. An older woman once recounted, "I lived for 50 years believing that God was in the temple. Today, I realize He was there when I decided to leave." This phrase echoed within me like a prayer, because that was exactly it. God was not lost, nor had He abandoned us. We were the ones who had locked Him within the walls of obedience. Now, by sharing our voices, we were opening the windows of our souls for Him to re-enter. It was in this environment of listening and empathy that my faith began to be rebuilt. Not a doctrinal faith, based on hierarchies and fear, but a living faith, one born from the encounter between truth and love. For the first time in years, I smiled again during prayer. There was no more guilt, no more shame, only gratitude for still being here, for having survived the lie with my whole soul. In one of these meetings, I decided to tell my story. When I finished, there was silence. For a few seconds, I thought I'd said too much, but then messages started appearing in the chat. "I've been through the same thing. Thank you for saying what I never had the courage to say. Your words made me feel less alone." It was at that moment that I understood the power of sharing. I had spent so long believing that silence would protect me, and now I saw that it was the truth that healed. I realized that when pain is shared, it loses its power to destroy us. After that, I started recording short audio messages and writing texts to help those going through the same process. It wasn't anything grand, just simple, sincere words. And, surprisingly, I started receiving messages from people saying those words made them cry, reflect, or simply breathe a sigh of relief. It was then that I realized that what had once been shame was now liberation. Bad memories still lingered, but they no longer dominated me. It was as if they'd lost their venom. They became scars, marks that don't hide pain, but prove survival. I understood that my story, like that of so many others, wasn't about destruction, but about rebirth. One day, I was invited to an in-person gathering of former members. I was nervous. It was the first time I would see in person those I had only known through screens for months. When I arrived, I found tired faces, but eyes full of brilliance. Real people, with real wounds, and immense courage. We sat in a circle, and the coordinator said, "Here, no one needs to prove they have faith. They just need to prove they still feel." We cried together. We laughed together. We prayed not to a prophet, nor to an institution, but directly to God, with the simplest, most human words I have ever used in my life. And in that moment, I felt the Spirit was there. Not the one the church sold me as a reward for obedience, but the real one, the one that emerges when the soul is honest. With each new story I heard, my heart opened wider. I realized that faith wasn't something I'd lost, it was something I was being purified. And as I began to see this, the anger and sadness gave way to something greater: compassion. Compassion for myself, for my wife, for those still trapped in fear, and even for the leaders who hurt me, because I realized they, too, are prisoners of the same system that deceived us. Today, I look back and see that everything that once shamed me, the doubts, the tears, the crisis, was what set me free. Pain taught me what sermons never taught: that God doesn't demand perfection. He demands truth. that faith isn't about repeating commandments, it's about listening to your heart, even when it tells you something different from what others want to hear. What was once shame is now liberation. And that's why I keep speaking, not out of anger, but out of love. Love for the truth, love for those who still suffer in silence, love for those who still believe that to question is to betray faith. Because, in the end, the greatest act of faith anyone can make is to dare to open their eyes. Coming to the end of this story, I feel it's not exactly a closure, it's a new beginning. For a long time, I thought faith was synonymous with silence, that loving God meant accepting everything without question. I was taught to obey, to believe without doubt, to remain silent in the face of whatever hurt me. But today I understand that silence was never God's language. He speaks through truth, even when it hurts, and it was this truth that set me free. I spent years afraid to share what I experienced, thinking my voice would bring shame, that my testimony would be considered rebellion. But now I know it wasn't rebellion, it was love. Love for justice, love for those who still suffer, and, above all, love for faith itself. Today I speak not out of anger, but out of love, because God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for an awakened conscience. As I write these words, I remember everyone I met on this journey, those who cried when they've heard me, those who had the courage to speak, and even those who were still afraid. I understand each of them, because I, too, was afraid. I was afraid of losing my community, my family, my salvation. But I realized that the real hell wasn't being outside the church, it was living inside it without being able to be sincere. The faith that has survived in me is different from the one I was taught. Before, it was a faith that demanded submission. Now, it is a faith that invites awareness. Before, I believed that God demanded perfection. Today, I believe that He only desires truth. Because true faith is not obedience, it is awareness. It took me years to understand that doubting isn't denying God, it's seeking Him more honestly. I discovered that doubt, when born of a desire to understand, is the deepest prayer a human being can make. That's how I began to find answers, not in books, not in pulpits, but in the sincere silence between myself and the divine. When I look back, I see how much I suffered trying to please people, leaders, prophets, everyone but myself and God. But now I realize He never asked me to. The God I know today is not the God of fear, nor the one who demands oaths. He is the God of freedom, the one who looks you in the eye and whispers, "You don't have to hide from me to love me." Many ask me if I still believe, and I answer, more than ever. Only now, I believe in a God who doesn't dwell in stone temples, nor is He limited to those with sacred titles. I believe in a God who dwells in the awakened consciousness, who reveals Himself in compassion, forgiveness, and the courage to be true. This courage wasn't born of a sudden miracle. It was shaped by pain, by disappointment, by the mourning of lost faith, but also by the love that endured, the love that kept me believing, even when everything seemed to be falling apart, the love that taught me that it's possible to leave religion without leaving God. Today, when I speak, I'm not seeking to convince anyone. I don't want to destroy beliefs or attack institutions. I simply want to offer my story as a mirror for those who need to hear that they are not alone. Because I know there are many living the same conflict, silent, believing that doubting is betrayal. But it isn't. Doubt, question, seek. God is not afraid of questions. Only humans are. And if you're listening to this right now, maybe this is your moment of awakening. Maybe you've felt the same tightness in your chest that I felt when I realized something was wrong. And if so, know this discomfort is the first sign of truth. It's God calling you to look beyond fear. It's not easy. There will be losses. People will call you an apostate, an ungrateful, a rebel. But every step away from lies is a step toward peace. And when peace arrives, it feels like light, a light that doesn't blind, but reveals. I speak today for myself, for my family, for my wife, for all who have suffered in silence within institutions that should heal, not hurt. I speak for those who still believe that silence is faithfulness, and I say, it is not. True fidelity is to the truth, and the truth, sooner or later, always wins. I don't speak to destroy anyone's faith. I speak so that it may be reborn, purer, freer, more human, because there is no true faith without compassion, and there is no compassion without courage. Today, when I look to the sky, I no longer see a distant God seated on a golden throne. I see a God who walks with me, who understands my doubts and embraces my failures, a God who prefers a sincere heart to an obedient mouth. And that's why I keep speaking out. Not because I want revenge, but because I want to free the voices that still tremble, the consciences that still fear, the hearts that were taught to love God but never themselves. Silence kept me trapped for years, but words gave me back my life. Today I know there is no faith where there is no truth. And if my story serves to awaken just one person, then all the suffering will have been worth it. Commente. I'm awake. I want to know the truth. Leave your like if this story touched you. Subscribe for more real stories. And see the next video. Another testimony from someone who also dared to tell the truth. Because, in the end, it all comes down to this. Faith doesn't require silence. It requires courage. And the courage to live truthfully is the greatest act of love a human being can offer to God.